the executive director of the Laramie Plains Museum Association. The Ivinsons coming to Laramie was serendipitous. The fact that they helped to create this community was very much serendipity. You talk about communities like this that were tent towns, and they became something if you had someone like Edward, who was concentrating on the economic development, and if you have someone like Jane, who was concentrating on the cultural development. Exactly what they did. And that's why we took root here, and we didn't die like some of the other towns along the railroad. Realized that in 1849 the Homestead Act had happened. People could come out into the West and get property for a song. If for nothing else, come and see, you know, because for $10 you had 100 acres. That was who arrived on that first train. An assortment of families, moms, dads, kids. Mr. and Mrs. Ivinson arrived with their personal maid and their young daughter Maggie. They had some stints back east, so they stayed in New York. They were married in New Jersey, and then they were in Iowa, they were in Illinois. They adopted their only child, who was Maggie. The Ivinsons bought this property, this full square block, from the Union Pacific, $400 in 1870, and they held this ground until 1892. They didn't build on it until 1892. And Mr. Ivinson was not only a merchant, but one of the first bankers in the state, because he had a safe that he arrived with, a heavy-duty safe that was on those cars that he first arrived with. And people in this Wild West town needed a secure place to put their money, to put their jewels. Mr. Ivinson did that, so he kind of naturally fell into banking. And then, of course, the Ivinsons were instrumental in bringing one of the first churches into Laramie, the Episcopal Church. They built the house in 1892 because the state Wyoming became a state in 1890. They thought Mr. Ivinson had a good run as a governor of the new state. So they built this as possibility of a second residence, you know, for the new governor.
I'm Judy Knight. The first word is usually wow. You know, people are not expecting this real showplace on frontier town. You know, if they know anything about Laramie's history, they know of us as a wild, open western town, and to have a place that is this grand is quite a shock. And it is, I think it does go way beyond expectations for most guests. The architect was Ware, who had been brought here to Laramie not as an architect but as a draftsman, or do the drawings for shops at the Union Pacific Yards, and he was from Nebraska.
Really wanted to make this a family community, and they did. The Ivinsons did do that. Mrs. Ivinson started the very first Sunday school in the back of their store downtown on the crates. And here, her story is that she would go to the gambling tents and say, we're going to hold a Sunday school service at 10 o'clock this morning. We would like you to quiet down during this time. And as soon as the service was over, you could hear again. Keno, $2, you know. So, and she wrote that literally in a letter in 1898 to Laramie Women's Club, saying that that's how she found her new town. And then Mrs. Ivinson's dream was that no Wyoming woman would be destitute in her old age. And that's how the Ivinson Home for Aged Ladies down on Grand Avenue came about. Yeah, when we talk about the Ivinsons' legacy, you know, when we give tours of this beautiful mansion, which houses the history of our area, it's from donors all over. It's say, well, you know, that's the old haunted Ivinson Mansion, because it was down and out throughout the 60s, you know, before the Museum Association was able to rescue it.
I came to Laramie in 1965, so I've seen this property as a new young faculty member at the University of Wyoming, where everybody who introduced me to Laramie said, the Ivinson Mansion is a disgrace. And it was. It was completely derelict. There were shingles on the lawn, the grass had never been mowed, the porch was falling off the building, it was boarded up. President of the Historical Society at the time, Alice Hardy Stevens, said, let's buy it. And the owners at that time were the Episcopal Church. They agreed to give her a certain length of time. The Laramie Women's Club endeavored to put coupons that they cut from magazines and newspapers, scotch tape them to canned goods and whatever at the grocery store, and then at checkout the checker would say, do you want the money from this coupon or shall it go in the Ivinson Fund? Here we are, having this conversation in this wonderful property that didn't get torn down. The original plan was for it to be all stone, but there was concern about the weight of that on the foundation. The contractor, Mr. Cook, was a prolific builder in Laramie, and he must have had a small army of carpenters and stonemasons and so on. And I believe he was the one who said, I really think it should be a lighter weight sheathing material on the upper two floors. So as you look at it now, you'll see the ground floor is stone, but the next two are shingle. It is Queen Anne in terms of time, 1892, and it has a variety of things going on the outside. It's very busy, and that's typical of Queen Anne architecture, but it's busier now as we look at it constructed because of those details in the shingle work. As you look at the exterior facade, you see that yes, it is asymmetrical to the extent that it has two towers and they're not the same. But it has two towers at either end, and it has a central symmetrical unit. That in itself tells you that we're leaving the Queen Anne aesthetic, starting to become a little more symmetrical, refined. It's the new aesthetic of Richardsonian Romanesque. We often give that name to Henry Hobson Richardson, because he was the architect of the East who really popularized that style. And his houses tended to be dark, whereas a Queen Anne Victorian house tended to be light, airy, vertically moving, that's for sure. But so this house blends both. It's got some of that darkness of the stone and lots of shadows. That's a feature of Queen Anne Victorian. From reading contemporary literature at the time, that this was referred to as an airing balcony. The maids were instructed to strip the beds every day and take the sheets and pillowcases and shake them off the balcony. We've done a lot of restoration with the mortar. I guess when you're restoring it, you call it tuck pointing to fit in new material there. The roof has been completely reshingled. Some decorative elements have been removed. The carriage house, of course, was built in 1892, exactly the same time as the mansion. Mr. Ivinson probably had a chauffeur or a driver, you know, I don't, whatever you call the person who managed the carriages and kept them shiny. And the carriage house today, with its French doors and all glassed in, is quite different looking than when it was originally, with what are essentially barn doors. One of the things that the Ivinsons did, and we credit this to Edward Ivinson, is that the wood in each of the main public rooms of the house is different. That's very unique. Usually there's a wood type, it's cherry, walnut, mahogany, whatever, and the whole house is done that way. But we have oak and a wonderful wood that's called sycamore that's not used much anymore. Birch, two different kinds of mahogany, is used to very good effect in the Ivinson Mansion, and the drawing room is maple. So that required setting aside and ordering a variety of different kinds of lumber, and of course that wouldn't have been possible at all without a railroad. So we have definitely a post-railroad house here.
And Mrs. Ivinson's dream was that this big, beautiful house, this big home, would be used as a school for girls, so that those girls who were in the outlying areas who couldn't get to town to go to school could have a home that they could come to, stay at, learn manners and their church studies, and go to school in town.
In addition to provide dormitory space, an auditorium, a gymnasium, a kitchen, a dining hall. Built in 1924, and the architect was Wilbur Hitchcock, who has done over 300 buildings in Laramie. And 1924, he was at his prime. And then when the museum took over, we renamed it for Alice Hardy Stevens, who is the person who had the vision to save the building.
It's precious. Our history is precious, and critical to preserve it so that we know from where we came. There's something wonderful when you give a tour and you can see starry eyes as they're looking at something that's in the kitchen that they remember from Grandma's house. It's history is why this mansion was saved, why we respect our heritage so much. Propels us forward, but it also anchors us. We can go tour a museum, we can go tour the Ivinson Mansion, know that Laramie was once just a spot on the open high plains prairie, and look at how it flourished because of the investment of families.